Critique of Moral Illusion. The roots of moral enlightenment reach back furthest of all into the past, and for good reasons. For with regard to morality, the deepest questions of all enlightenment is decided, the question of the good life. That human beings are not really what they pretend to be is an age-old motif of critical moral thinking. Jesus provided the model in his attack against those who harshly judge others. How wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull the splinter out of thine eye, when, behold, a plank is in thine own eye, thou hypocrite? Matthew 7, verses 4 and 5. The critique of the New Testament already assumes an artful doubling. Wolves in sheep's clothing, moralists with a plank in their eye, Pharisaism. From its first movement, this critique of morality proceeds metamorally, here psychologically. It assumes as a basic principle that the outward moral appearance is deceptive. A closer inspection would show how moralists in fact do not serve the law, but cover up their own lawlessness by criticizing others. Matthew 7:4 contains psychoanalysis in a nutshell. What disturbs me in others is what I myself am. However, as long as I do not see myself, I do not recognize my projections as the outward reflection of my own plank, but as the depravity of the world. Indeed, the reality component of the projection, as psychoanalysts would say today, should not be my first concern. Even if the world really is depraved, I should be concerned about my own defects first. What Jesus teaches is a revolutionary self-reflection. Start with yourself, and then, if others really need to be enlightened, show them how, by your own example. Of course, under the normal conditions in the world, things proceed the other way around. The lawgivers start with others, and it remains uncertain whether they will also get around to themselves. They refer to laws and conventions that are supposedly absolute. But the wolves in sheep's clothing enjoy looking at these laws and conventions more or less from above and from outside. Only they are still allowed to know about the ambivalence of things. Only they, because they are lawgivers, feel the breath of freedom beyond the legislation. The real sheep are forced under the either-or. For no state can be made with self-reflection and with irony directed against the existing order. States are always also coercive apparatuses that cease to function when the sheep begin to say, I. Not I as in yes, I as in the self, me, I. When the sheep begin to say I, and when the subjugated free themselves from conventions through reflection. As soon as those at the bottom gain the knowledge of ambivalence, a wrench is thrown into the works, enlightenment against the automatism of obedience and achievement. Christian ethics of self-reflection, the return to oneself in making judgments, is political dynamite. Since the freedom of a Christian person suspends every naive belief in norms, Christian cooperation and Christian coexistence are no longer possible on the basis of state government, Staatlichkeit, or civitas. That is, of coerced communality, but only on the basis of community, Gesellschaftslichkeit, communitas, societas, communism, socialism. The real state needs blind subjects, whereas society can understand itself only as a commune of awakened individualities. This establishes the deep bond between Christianity and communism, of which the anarchists in the 19th and early 20th centuries tried to remind us. For the rules according to which life in the anarchist commune is ordered are free, self-imposed bonds, not alien hierarchically imposed laws. The commune dreams of a permanent renewal of the law through consensus. The original idea of the church still contains something of this communio model. Of course, this model degenerates quickly in the transition to the organised church. Thereafter it lives on estranged and truncated in the great religious orders. The official church, however, develops more and more into a parody of the state and into a coercive apparatus of wondrous proportions. This schizophrenia was rationalised for millennia to come by the Church's teacher, St. Augustine, in his doctrine of the two kingdoms, the divine and the temporal, which the Augustinian monk Luther continued to maintain. That in this doctrine, Augustine applies the concept civitas to the religious community signals its political corruption. It may seem curious, but understandable, that only with the modern movements towards democracy has a fundamental Christian thought again come into political play. Western democracies are basically permanent parodies of religious anarchism, peculiar mixtures of coercive apparatuses and orders of freedom. In them the rule applies, an illusory ego for everyone. Herein lies at the same time the Catholic irony in the modern world. For Catholicism, with its dogma and its absolutist organisation, protrudes into a liberalised social order like an archaic hulk. It is still against the temporal order only in the sense that it maintains its perverse alliance with the centralised power of states, just as it had done with the Western Roman Empire, Northern European feudalism, and with the absolutism of the 17th and 18th centuries. That is why today's central powers, which have at least learned to play the liberal game a little, are somewhat embarrassed in their relations to the openly authoritarian Vatican. Only with Mussolini's fascism could Catholicism be brought back into the loathsome modernity of the Concordats. This preamble is perhaps useful for understanding the point of departure for the later Critique of Morality. In the course of its history, Christianity repudiates its own moral structure, a structure of self-reflection superior to conventions. In a word, it itself becomes a conventional, coercive organisation. It thus degenerates from the free standpoint of meta-ethics, which, with a clear view of reality and with a love full of reason, says what one should do, to the trite standpoint of "thou shalt." Originally directed against Pharisaism, it has become, through its political success, the most hypocritical ideology the world has ever known. This has been generally well known in Europe since the late Middle Ages. Since that time, the wolves in Christian sheep's clothing have been distinguished from the sheep, and from those exceptional people who, in spite of Christianity, made something of the opportunities it offered. Since the end of the Middle Ages, that is, ever since written documents have recorded the voice of the people and their realism, a good proportion of the people have not let themselves be deceived about this split in morality. The lustful monk, the bellicose prelate, the cynical cardinal, and the corrupt pope, these are standard figures in popular realism. No theoretical critique has been able to add anything essential to this satirical approach. The unmasking of the clergy belongs to Catholicism, like laughter to satire. In laughter, all theory is anticipated. The critique of morality, however, has not advanced as laughter, and this is connected with the role of Protestantism in the renovation of moralism. Catholicism can be content in the last analysis with satire on the clergy. Protestantism, by contrast, must push the critique of morality forward to the exposure of the layperson, of the fake Christian, and consequently of everyone. The French Enlightenment directs its moral satire against the personnel in the Catholic spectacle, the nuns, priests, the all too pious virgins, and all too holy prelates. Heinrich Heine's attacks, too, are directed against Catholicism and can remain satirical. All this is innocuous compared with the critique of the morality internalised by Protestant lay people. How good-natured Diderot's cutting jokes are compared with the critique of Christianity exercised by the son of a Lutheran pastor, Friedrich Nietzsche. There is a clear difference of degree, and also a healthy distance between the Roman Catholic and the Protestant Germanic Enlightenment. For the special complications of religious existence are ultimately reserved in Catholicism for the clergy. In Protestant countries, the critique of morality necessarily leads to the self-exposure of whole societies and classes. In such countries, particularly in northern Germany and North America, moral enlightenment is therefore unthinkable without its socio-masochist components. A second fertile ground is emancipated Judaism. Marx, Heine, Freud, Adorno, among others, which, as Hannah Arendt has shown convincingly, retains a certain outsider viewpoint, predisposed towards critique, even though it is strongly assimilated into bourgeois society. The critique of morality pursues essentially three strategies: uncovering a second set of rules, double standard, inversion of being and illusion, and reduction to a realistic original motive. The uncovering of the second set of rules is the simplest procedure, since those roles are immediately apparent through mere observation. Jesus said, "You will recognize them by their fruits." The test of life is decisive. Enlightenment does nothing more than eavesdrop on likely wolves in their dressing rooms, where they put on and take off their sheep's clothing. One has only to hide behind a curtain or under the bed and watch what happens when the suspected wolves are alone together. In this, sexual unmasking has a special value. The abbot, who has to hide in the bedroom closet from the husband returning home. The upright family man who is seen in the dark street disappearing into the house with the red light. The Prime Minister who forgets his glasses in the brothel. Can one also sort out grapes from the thorns or figs from the thistles? This flagrant literature could bear the title of one of the most well-known pornographic books of 18th century Enlightenment, Mirabeau's The Aired Curtain. In all these works, critique did not yet deviate from a sensual, satirical approach. In this tradition, moral duplicity itself was long regarded as a moral fact, as scandal. Only a cynical man-of-the-world attitude could go so far as to shrug its shoulders about it and soberly accept it as mere fact. Worldly knowledge recognises the moral world as a compositum of two worlds. There probably has to be a worldview for practical men who must be strong enough to get their hands dirty in political practice without becoming dirty themselves. And even if they do, who cares? And a second worldview for youths, simpletons, women, and sensitive souls for whom purity is just the right thing. One could call it a division of labour among temperaments, or the ugliness of the world. Worldly knowledge knows how to calculate them. Worldly knowledge knows how to calculate with both. In the inversion of being and illusion, critique first separates the facade from the core, in order then to attack the latter as the actual exterior. The most important points of attack are provided by the nerve centres of Christian morality, in goodness as well as in evil. The ethics of compassion and altruism, the commandment to love one's neighbour. Here again, enlightenment tries to outflank deception with suspicion. Indeed, it even denies, not unrealistically, the possibility of a perfect deception of a mentally alert enlightener. Quoting Nietzsche, Wirkensweibenden, "One lies with the mouth, but with the grimace that one makes in doing so, one says the truth after all." The core does not remain hidden. The psychologist, in Nietzsche's sense, sees the self-pity and resentment shining through the compassion that is shown. A form of egoism shines through every act of altruism. The psychology of the courtly age had an edge of bourgeois thinking with these observations. La Rochefoucauld has already skillfully uncovered the game of self-love, amour-propre, in all its masks of fellowship and morality. Following La Rochefoucauld, Nietzsche's critique of Christianity could achieve the stage of maturity, that is, the stage of utter nakedness. The more hollow the lie of altruism revealed itself to be in capitalist society, in which striving for profit and utilitarianism imposed themselves more and more brutally, the easier it was for critical, naturalistic thought to suggest that everyone is his own closest neighbour. But Schiller says, "The upright man thinks of himself last." Wilhelm Tell. Nietzsche hears the nonsense ringing through Schiller's idealism. He speaks mercilessly of the moral trumpeter from Säckingen. The naturalist claims to know that everyone, whether upright or not, thinks of himself first and last. Indeed, every attempt to think of others first is bound to fail, because thinking cannot leave its domicile in the ego. To deny the primacy of self-love would mean to invert all relations. Nietzsche accuses Christianity of this original falsification, this fundamental distortion, with disquieting sharpness. Bourgeois morality tries to maintain an illusion of altruism, whereas in all other bourgeois thinking has long since assumed a theoretical as well as an economic egocentrism. Nietzsche's critique, apart from the religious poisoning by his family, is a reaction against the morally stifling atmosphere of the late 19th century, when international imperialisms, in the disguise of idealism and worn-out Christian bearing, were setting out to subjugate the rest of the world. The First World War was secretly hoped for by countless contemporaries who expected a moral cleansing from it. The edifying lies of Christianized imperialism had become too suffocating. The resonance of Nietzsche enjoyed among imperialists had its moral foundation in the cynicism of self-disinhibition. This cynicism makes a continuum between a subtle philosophy and a brutal politics possible for the first time. The flight into confession is one of the characteristic movements of modern consciousness, which tries to shake off the existential ambiguities of all morality. It is this flight that opens moral consciousness for cynicism on a broad front. The third strategy concludes the process of unmasking with the discovery of an original motive. The French moralists called it self-love, amour-propre. Nietzsche called it the will to power. If Marxism spoke in psychological terms, which, according to its logic, it cannot do, it would call the original motive the striving for profit. But it argues in non-psychological terms. The striving for profit falls in the last instance behind the character mask, so that the capitalist, as an individual, may be as miserly or as selfless as he likes. For its part, psychoanalysis, having developed in the climate of Nietzsche and the neo-romantics, encounters final motives that have nothing to do with altruism and idealism. Important in psychoanalysis is the dialectical moments in the theory of drives, which assumes a two-pronged drive nature, ego drives and sexual drives. In the later version, life drive and death drive. The exposure of morality becomes explosive when it is not exercised by private persons on private persons, or as admission in the context of a confessional relation. Since the 18th century, enlighteners have concerned themselves, as defenders of true morality, whatever that may be, with the morality of those who rule. Here, for the first time, the critique of morality shows its political barbs. From this line of critique comes a whole literature about the gluttony of tyrants and the unmasking of the aristocracy's corruption. Schiller's Robbers and Lessing's Amelia Galotti are the best-known examples of this genre. The moralism and the bourgeois sense of decency put aristocratically refined immoralism in the position of the politically accused. In substance, bourgeois moral literature already exercises a critique of cynicism. It describes states of consciousness in which unethical life, Unsichtlichkeit, is self-reflective. But bourgeois thinking all too naively assumes it is possible to subordinate political power to moral concepts. It does not anticipate that one day, when it has itself come to power, it will end up in the same ambivalence. It has not yet realised that it is only a small step from taking moral offence to respectable hypocrisy. Heinrich Heine fought in vain against the narrow-minded moralism of bourgeois enlightenment. The German public could not follow his cynical, satirical protest. One of the characteristics of German Enlightenment is that, under the influence of petty bourgeois Protestantism, it seldom mustered the power to be cheeky. Where the public itself did not resist, there were courts to exercise censorship. Only in the 20th century has impudent cheekiness, the socio-psychological foundation of an enlightenment on the offensive that does not first ask the authorities whether it is welcome, created subcultural niches for itself in cabaret and in bohemianism. It failed, lamentably, to ally itself with the main force of social opposition, the workers' movement, for in the latter, the political moral critique of the ruling strata was transformed into something that could easily be taken for petty bourgeois morality. The workers' movement rarely examined itself from the perspective of moral critique. Also, at first, its demands were so persuasive that only the political reaction could have an interest in suspecting something behind them. The complex moral area of envy and social resentment was in fact treated instead from the perspective of an anti-socialistically inspired thinking, from Nietzsche to Schoeck. However, since the relative historical success of the workers' movement, its original ingenuousness has evaporated. It too has long since been infected by ambivalences. But whether as social partner in the West or as state power in the East, it does not want to acknowledge anything other than a purely political will to power in its ranks. This is the reason for its moral weakness. Indeed, Marxism has denounced the impulses of Nietzsche and the depth psychologies with all its might, and every personal encounter with people from the Eastern sphere of influence proves how astoundingly pre-psychological the mentality is in which they are kept. As if two of the greatest psychologists of modernity, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, had not been Russians. The state based on force presupposes blind subjects. It does everything it can to keep powers of reflection that have long been available from becoming effective.